At its peak, the Anglo-French Concorde was the epitome of technological prowess and super-sleek design in 20th century aviation. It was considered the most beautiful commercial plane the world had ever seen, and being the West's first supersonic jet, it was also the fastest of its era. However, the Concorde was not the first supersonic plane to make it to market. This honor went to a Soviet aircraft that reached supersonic speed months before the Concorde, and one that briefly became the pride of the USSR before its ultimate failure. The communist version of the Concorde was the Tupolev Tu-144, and it was the first passenger aircraft to fly at more than twice the speed of sound. The Tupolev's first flight occurred 3 months before the Concorde took to the air on March 2, 1969. But the Tu-144, which was dubbed Concordsky by Western observers for its similarities to its Western rival, never became quite as popular. It was perhaps most notable as the first commercial supersonic plane to have a crash landing, which it did not once, but twice. Like many of the great technological feats of the Cold War, political rivalry was at the heart of the Tu-144's story. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, became aware in 1960 of a new supersonic aircraft project being undertaken by Britain and France. The plane that would become the Concorde was conceptualized as a passenger aircraft designed to fly at supersonic speeds, cutting the time it would take to fly from Europe to the US to just a few hours. Fighter planes like the Soviet Union's MiG-21 and the US's F-104 were already capable of flying at twice the speed of sound, so commercial supersonic travel seemed a viable, if daunting, task. Khrushchev immediately demanded that the Soviets develop a similar aircraft, only it needed to be quicker than Concorde and completed first. The allure of beating the West to the punch superseded any protocols for safety or craft. This was the height of the Cold War, and as Jacques Lowe, a former Concorde pilot, observed, there was the space race and the race to put a man on the moon happening at the same time. The USSR's rapid industrialization and considerable successes in the space race in the early 1960s had emboldened Soviet leaders, convincing them that the country needed to take on even more impressive projects to outdo the West. The technological and scientific expectations of the Soviet elites were immense. The Tu-144 project simply had to succeed. Such was its importance to the Soviet leadership. The catch was that the space race had shifted Soviet focus to long-range rockets and high-altitude missiles. Therefore, the Tu-144 had to be developed separately as a standalone civil aircraft program. As if the Soviet engineers weren't under enough pressure already, the supersonic aircraft had to also present a comfortable experience for passengers and be economically viable. These requirements were unfamiliar to the Soviet aviation industry and offered a unique challenge. The Tu-144, as designed, was undoubtedly bigger than the Concorde. It was over 215 feet in length, almost 12 feet longer than its Western rival. It would be able to cruise at just over Mach 2, or 1,340 miles per hour, and each of its 4 engines could generate more than 44,000 pounds of thrust each, which was 6,000 pounds more thrust from each engine than the Concorde could achieve. However, several problems plagued the Tu-144's development, including issues with the plane's brakes and engine control system. For example, their brakes could not withstand the enormous heat generated when trying to slow the aircraft after landing. Being more powerful meant that the Tu-144 needed more lift and power to get it into the air. Part of its weight problem was its enormous undercarriage. It required no less than 12 wheels underneath its wings, partly because Russian tires were made of synthetic rubber and were more prone to failure. The Soviets circumvented some of these issues with its most distinctive feature, which was a pair of winglets or canards located right behind the cockpit. These winglets provided extra lift and improved handling at low speeds. The Tu-144 first took flight in December 1968 and flew at supersonic speed for the first time in June 1969. The Concorde would not take to the air until March 1969, and it did not go supersonic until October 1969. When the Soviets unveiled the Tu-144 at the Paris Air Show in 1971, everyone was impressed. The French president, Georges Pompidou, called it, quote, a beautiful plane. Even the makers of Concorde conceded that the Soviet supersonic plane seemed, quote, quieter and cleaner. Ilya Grinberg, a Soviet aviation expert and engineering professor, would say this about the Soviet plane, quote, "Expectations were high. The entire USSR was extremely proud of the Tu-144, and the Soviet people had no doubt that it was better than Concorde. And it was so pretty." However, some Western observers suspected foul play, believing that the only way the Soviet Union could have devised the Tu-144 was through industrial espionage. The Tu-144 was patronizingly dubbed the Concordski in an effort to diminish it as a carbon copy of the Concorde, albeit with cruder Soviet touches. It is true that the Tu-144 was heavily influenced by Concorde. However, its engine configuration, for example, was notably different. The Tu-144 also needed to be more rugged to cope with tougher operating conditions in the Soviet Union. It may have resembled the Concorde, but differed quite substantially in refinement and detail. The Soviets planned to unveil an updated version of the Tu-144 on June 3, 1973, at the Paris Air Show. The Soviet plane was to go head-to-head at the show against a prototype by Concorde. At the time, the Concorde had still not gone into production. Tu-144 test pilot Mikhail Koslov apparently taunted the Concorde team by saying, quote, "Just wait until you see us fly, then you'll see something." The Soviet crew was intent on surpassing Concorde's flying display from the day before, which had been somewhat cautious. The specific aircraft involved was Tupolev Tu-144S CCCP 77102, manufacturer's serial number 01-2. That aircraft had first flown on March 29, 1972, although it had been significantly modified. It featured engine housings, or nacelles, split on either side of the fuselage, with landing gear that retracted into the nacelles and retractable canards. The Tu-144 had taken off from Le Bourget Airport and approached the runway as if to make a landing, with its nose dropped and its undercarriage down. The landing gear was out, and the canards clearly extended. But something was off. The crowd watched in awe as the plane then climbed suddenly and rapidly, with all four of its engines at full power. Seconds later, tragedy struck. The plane likely stalled just below 2,000 feet, pitched over, and then went into a steep dive. With the pilots desperately trying to pull out of the dive and the engines again at full power, the Tu-144 broke up in midair, the left wing breaking off first, possibly due to overstressing of the airframe. The aircraft disintegrated further and crash-dived into the nearby village of Goussainville, destroying 15 houses in the process. All of the drama took place in front of 250,000 people, including the plane's famous designer, Alexei Tupolev. There were several theories as to why the Tu-144 crashed. One theory was that the pilot had maneuvered too hard at slow speed, causing the plane to lose lift and thus stall. Another theory was that in the heat of their extreme rivalry with the Anglo-French Concorde, the Soviet pilots had attempted a maneuver that was beyond the aircraft's capabilities. Bob Hoover, a pilot for America's failed supersonic Bell X-1 program, firmly believed that the rivalry between the Tu-144 and Concorde is what led the Soviet pilot of the Tu-144 to attempt the deadly maneuver. Ilya Grinberg would state how, quote, "The Soviet pilots attempted to impress the public and the world's press to show that the Soviet plane could be sexier than the more conservative display of the Concorde. That's quite clear from the footage." Also among the rumors, cloudy conditions that day may have confused the crew. The plane had to swerve to avoid a French Mirage fighter jet that was flying too close in order to take pictures of the Tupolev's front canards, which were advanced for their time. And the Concorde's Anglo-French design team had deliberately passed on flawed blueprints of their plane because they believed the Soviets would try to steal them. All have mostly been disproven. The crash only highlighted the many issues with Tupolev's pioneering design, and so Tupolev had to fix a myriad of problems before the aircraft could be signed off for service with the state airline Aeroflot. It was only in 1977 that the Tu-144 started transporting passengers. In the end, the Soviets' take on the Concorde was not a success. It was considered especially cramped. Several ceiling panels were ajar, service trays stuck, and window shades dropped without being pulled. Worst of all, the engines and air conditioning units both created enormous noise, made worse by the plane's ability to only be able to sustain supersonic speeds by using very loud afterburners. Passengers described the noise as, quote, "an ear-shattering roar that made conversation impossible." Passengers would relate how they could only communicate with each other in the cabin by passing notes. as Jonathan Glancy wrote in his book Concorde, quote, "A flight on the Tu-144 was not for those with sensitive hearing." Many technical issues plagued the Tu-144 flights, ranging from sudden depressurization to engine failure to blaring alarms that couldn't be switched off. Perhaps very tellingly, each flight from Moscow could only depart after the aircraft had been personally inspected by the plane's designer, Alexei Tupolev himself. Aeroflot only used the Tu-144 to serve the rather obscure 2-hour route between Moscow and Alma-Ata, then the capital of Kazakhstan. It was chosen because it passed over sparsely populated areas, but the weekly flights were mostly half-empty, and the plane ended up transporting more cargo and mail than people. The service was finally canceled after only 55 return flights. The project was likely delivered its death blow on May 23, 1978, when disaster struck again. A commercial Tu-144 flight caught fire near Moscow and made an emergency landing. The accident prompted a complete ban on passenger flights of the Tu-144, but by then, Soviet leaders had already had enough of the costly and problematic program. The Tu-144's production officially ended in 1982. By contrast, the Concorde became a brief success in the West, with thousands of transcontinental flights flown by Air France and British Airways. But even the Concorde was eventually met with a similar fate, despite its more illustrious career and sparkling safety ratings. On July 25, 2000, an Air France Concorde crashed during takeoff at Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport, when a piece of runway debris blew out the plane's tires and punctured its fuel tank. The Concorde went up in flames. In an eerie bit of symmetry, the 2000 Concorde crash happened just 9 miles from where the first Tu-144 crashed in June 1973. On March 18, 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov stepped outside of his Voskhod 3KD spacecraft for a total of 12 minutes and 9 seconds to become the first man to ever walk in space. It was a harrowing mission. Leonov's spacesuit pressurization failed during the walk, and he was nearly unable to return to the spacecraft. Leonov had a cyanide capsule with him, should that actually have been the case. It was perhaps due to this experience and Leonov's proven ability under pressure, then, that he was chosen for another historic first. The Soviets' top-secret mission to the Moon called for a similar spacewalk transfer to a Soviet landing vehicle. The Soviets intended for Leonov to be the first man to walk on the Moon. Alexei Leonov was born in Altai, Siberia, on May 30, 1934. Just 2 years later, his father was imprisoned as an enemy of the people during a Stalinist purge. Many people disappeared during this period, but his father was not one of them. He was returned to the family after they moved to Kemerovo. Young Leonov would draw or paint and sell his art to assist with the family finances, doing primarily still life and landscape art. His dream was to be an artist, and in fact he was accepted by the Academy of Arts in Riga. He, however, had to decline the offer due to the costs. Instead, he went to a Ukrainian preparatory school for pilots, flying solo for the first time in 1955. He became a fighter pilot at the Chuguyev Higher Air Force Pilot School. He studied art part-time as he continued his formal schooling. He eventually joined the 113th Parachute Aviation Regiment as a lieutenant in Kiev. In 1960, Leonov was chosen as one of 20 Soviet Air Force pilots to partake in cosmonaut training. On March 18, 1965, he left his mark on history as the first human being to exit a spacecraft for extravehicular activity. Taking off on the Voskhod 2 spacecraft, since the Voskhod 1 craft failed, Leonov was elemental to the string of victories that the USSR won during the space race. He would later comment in an interview with the French Fédération Aéronautique Internationale that his first reaction to exiting the spacecraft was the absolute affirmation that, quote, "the Earth is round." Leonov remained in open space for just over 12 minutes, tethered to the spacecraft by a 16-foot cable. He recalled feeling the intense warmth of the sun on his face, which was not protected by a filter, and was impressed by the absolute silence that reigns in space. Unfortunately for Leonov, not everything was smooth sailing. Once his comrade, Pavel Ivanovich Belyaev, known as Pasha to friends and family, let him know it was time to go back in, the complications started. Leonov described the terrifying realization that took place in an article for Airspace magazine, quote, "Our orbit would soon take us away from the sun and into darkness. It was then I realized how deformed my stiff spacesuit had become, owing to the lack of atmospheric pressure. My feet had pulled away from my boots, and my fingers from the gloves attached to my sleeves, making it impossible to re-enter the airlock feet first. He had to find a swift solution, and bravely settled on pulling himself into the airlock slowly, head first, the opposite of what the general procedure called for. The only way for the spacesuit to yield and return to a more maneuverable form was to release some of the pressurized oxygen through a valve. This move was extremely risky, as it could have resulted in his death. He took the risk, knowing that staying outside also meant certain death in 40 minutes or less. He decided not to report his course of action to ground control in order to keep stress to a minimum and to avoid receiving conflicting or uncertain orders that might put him at more risk. The moment the complications became evident, the spacecraft radio and television transmissions were cut off. As he began depressurizing his suit, he could reportedly feel the heat rising, which required even more physical exertion from him. He was able to curl his body around so the airlock could be closed, and Belyayev turned on the equalizer and pressurizing mechanism. Leonov returned to the spacecraft sweaty and exhausted. The mission continued without any more major bumps until they were due to return to Earth. Their guidance system failed, and they had to conduct a manual re-entry, meaning they had to estimate the landing spot, along with the precise length for which the rocket would be on. They soon realized that landing would have to happen almost 1,000 miles to the west of the pre-planned landing site. As leader of the two-man crew, Leonov was in charge of navigating and determining the landing site. He recalled making a choice in his article for Airspace magazine, quote, "Our orbit would take us right over Moscow. We could set down in Red Square, but we had to choose somewhere as sparsely populated as possible. I decided on an area close to the city of Perm, just west of the Ural Mountains. We could not run the risk of overshooting so much that we came down in China. Relations with the People's Republic were poor at the time." Belyayev was in charge of orienting the craft, and both had to immediately return to their seat positions as soon as they were done dealing with the mechanics, as re-entering required that the center of gravity aboard Voskhod 1 was exact. As they entered Earth, however, the vehicle still entered a spin. The spacecraft fortunately stabilized 100 kilometers above the ground once the landing module snapped free from a cable connected to the orbital module. They landed in 2 meters of snow, with no specialized supplies to withstand the temperature of Siberia. When Belyayev asked him how soon he thought the rescue effort would take, Leonov jokingly replied, quote, "In 3 months, maybe they'll find us with dog sleighs." Pilots were soon flying around the area, assessing the situation or delivering supplies. One pilot sent down a bottle of cognac that burst upon hitting the ground, and others provided more helpful items, such as weather-resistant clothes. Complicating the rescue effort was the thick woods all around them. To stay alive, they slept that night huddled together inside the capsule, but the detached exit hatch left a hole that could not be covered. The next morning, a rescue team arrived, including 2 doctors and a cameraman. They all had to remain at the site, while the forest around them was chopped down for a rescue helicopter to land. The unexpected trials of Voskhod 2 proved that Leonov was not only an excellent cosmonaut, but one that could act well and calmly under the pressure of complex situations. To Soviet leadership, this signaled that he was the man to send to the moon. While the United States publicized its efforts, including success and failures, the USSR's attempt to place a man on the moon were far more discreet. Many details remained under wraps until after the fall of the USSR. The N-1 moonlander the Soviets were designing was more complicated than what NASA was assembling. Leonov himself described the main difference in an interview for the Science Museum, quote, "When approaching the moon, I would have to spacewalk from the descent module into the lunar lander. At a set time, the spacecraft and the lunar descent module would separate. I would be the only person on the lunar lander." To train for the daunting task, Leonov participated in exercises using an altered Mi-4 helicopter. It would be flown 110 meters up, the engine would be turned off, and then he would have to land the chopper using air-induced auto-rotation. The theory behind these exercises was that the vertical speed of the helicopter matched what the rate of the lander would be as it descended to the moon. A total of 9 of these helicopter landings were conducted by the cosmonaut. Things got rocky for the Soviet space program when the head designer, Sergei Korolev, passed away during an accident in 1966. Without him, the team couldn't get their massive 345-foot-tall N-1 rocket to work. Its strange design, featuring many small engines right next to each other, threatened to fail and implode if only one of the engines failed. The first stage had 2 rings with an added total of 30 rockets. What this meant for the scientists involved was that the N-1 needed to be extremely reliable before it was approved for space travel. All 4 attempted launches failed disastrously. Leonov would later claim that he believes the rocket would have worked if Korolev had lived to continue supervising the project. The death of the Soviet moon landing came with Neil Armstrong's walk on the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969. Leonov would have no other opportunities to go to the moon. This mission was not the only one cancelled by the USSR that Leonov was supposed to fly on. Earlier in his career, Vasily Mishin had tried to blame him for the failure of the rocket for the world's first space station, Salyut 1. Mishin argued that the most likely reason for the rocket failing was that one of Leonov's colored pencils had gotten into the ventilation system. His claim was disproved by the official investigation. Leonov's next venture into space came in 1975, with the surprising development of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, the very first manned international space mission. With space race tensions easing up after the moon landing, the USSR and United States were more open to collaborating on a space mission that would have once been unimaginable. The plan was for each country to launch their own spacecraft, and then for the astronauts and cosmonauts to unite once they were in orbit. On the Soviet side, Leonov commanded the mission and was accompanied by Valery Nikolaevich Kubasov, traveling aboard the Soyuz 19. The American mission was led by Thomas Stafford in the company of first-timers Vance Brand and Deke Slayton on board an unnumbered Apollo craft. The two spacecraft were linked once in orbit, and Leonov waited in the joint docking module for the astronauts to open the hatch of their spacecraft. Stafford was the first American to shake hands with a Soviet in space. The two space crews exchanged gifts, visited each other, and ate meals together for 2 days. Both crews learned the other's language, with Leonov later joking they had often spoken Oklahomsky, English with Stafford's Oklahoma accent. The mission served as a sign to the world that the two rival nations were open to cooperation. It eventually resulted in coordinated efforts on the Mir space station and finally the International Space Station. In 1969, a Soviet army deserter fired at a motorcade carrying Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev in an assassination attempt. Leonov and other cosmonauts were in limousines that were part of the motorcade. Leonov got away unharmed, and the attacker was arrested. Other than that incident, he was able to live a peaceful and celebrated life. The cosmonaut received 21 Soviet honors, 8 foreign government ones, and several other private initiative recognitions or awards. He continued his work as an artist, publishing books of his works and collaborations. His art can be found in galleries around the world, with the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow hosting around 200 of his paintings. He consulted on several space-related films. Alexei Leonov combined his passion for visual arts with his profession as a cosmonaut for the rest of his life.
Because I want to be a movie star.
Imagine being trapped in space and finding out that your country no longer exists. That's what happened to Sergei Krikalev, the last Soviet cosmonaut of the USSR. On December 26, 1991, his nation collapsed, and he was left stranded over 200 miles above Earth on the Mir space station, without a valid passport and with no day of return in sight. Sergei Krikalev was born in Leningrad, the capital of the Soviet Union. He graduated from the Leningrad Mechanical Institute with a degree in mechanical engineering. He began working for Energia soon after, a Soviet corporation highly involved in the development of spacecraft and stations. When the Salyut 7 space station lost communication with the USSR, Sergei Krikalev was on ground control for the successful rescue mission. In 1985, the Soviet Union selected him for cosmonaut training, which he completed by 1986. He first worked on the one and only launch of the Buran shuttle orbiter. It was an automated mission that took the spacecraft twice around planet Earth. After that, he was selected for a long-duration mission aboard the Mir station, in low orbit, planned by France and the USSR. After training, he went on his first spaceflight aboard the Soyuz TM-7, along with his commander Alexander Volkov and the French astronaut Jean-Luc Chrétien. Starting on November 26, 1988, and returning to the ground in late April of 1989, Krikalev spent 5 months, 151 days at Mir. During his time in the space station, the cosmonaut participated in 6 extravehicular activities, or EVAs, the installation of a module, and the testing of an astronaut propulsion unit. For the first 25 days of the mission, the crew of the Soyuz TM-7 overlapped with the previous Mir crew, totaling the longest time period that a 6-person crew had been in Earth's orbit. Krikalev began communicating with radio operators on the ground, mostly amateurs. an activity he would repeat throughout his illustrious career. He formed a close relationship with operator Margaret LeQuinto. They spoke over packet radio, marking the first time in history that an orbiting station and an amateur operator had a line of communication. Furthermore, he spoke to ground engineer Yelena Terekina, falling in love from space. As soon as Krikalev landed, preparations for his next flight commenced. This time, the mission was scheduled to last 8 months on the Mir station, with 10 intended EVAs. He trained throughout the next few months and took off in May of 1991. Before that, however, he had time to marry Yelena Terekina and conceive a daughter. The Soyuz TM-12 flight was commanded by Anatoly Archabarkse and included Helen Sherman, the first Briton in space. Her seat was paid for through a private consortium and Soviet funding. As they approached Mir, something went wrong, and the targeting system of Soyuz TM-12 stopped working. Sherman was worried, but she would later describe that Krikalev was calm and collected under the pressing circumstances. The Russian cosmonaut aimed the craft manually, and they were able to board Mir. The 3 of them joined the previous crew of 2. Only 8 days after arrival, Sherman headed back down to Earth with the 2 cosmonauts that had been staying in Mir. They landed in Kazakhstan on May 26, 1991, in the return capsule of the Soviet TM-11. Over that summer, Archabarkse and Krikalev undertook 6 extravehicular exercises and worked on multiple experiments. Krikalev was blissfully unaware that his 8-month mission would extend with no end in sight, as his country fell apart hundreds of miles below him. The Soviet Union would dissolve into 15 nations. His hometown of Leningrad would turn into St. Petersburg, and he would be left in space with an outdated passport as the last citizen of the Soviet Union. Life at the Mir space station was busy. Between scientific work, necessary exercise, and maintenance, the cosmonauts had little to no recreational time. They partook in 6 EVAs throughout 5 months to upgrade and repair parts of the station. 2 flights came in with additional supplies. The Progress M8 arrived on May 30th, 1991, and the Progress M9 on August 20th. For their extravehicular activities, they had to work over 32 hours on repairs to the Kurs antenna, used for automated docking. As July rolled in, Krikalev agreed to continue serving as flight engineer. Since the 2 incoming flights for October had been turned to 1, an engineer being sent on that mission was not prepared for a long-duration mission. The crew of Soyuz TM-14 landed on October 2nd and left a few days later on October 10th, taking Krikalev's companion, Archabarkse, with them. Alexander Volkov, the commander, stayed behind with Krikalev. As Volkov and Krikalev continued with their daily tasks in the space station, the nation that had sent them up there was racing to an unprecedented end. Krikalev received whatever news he could about the state of the USSR through Margaret LeQuinto and his wife Yelena. LeQuinto would send them an electronic bulletin with Western news and media information regarding the approaching death of the Soviet Union. Yelena would communicate regularly over radio, now taking care of their 9-month-old daughter all by herself. The situation first got worrisome for the cosmonauts in August of 1991, when a failed coup on Gorbachev destabilized the Union. Krikalev would later recall, quote, "We didn't understand what happened. When we discussed all this, we tried to grasp how it would affect the space program." Krikalev worried about his family, with the future of the space program hanging in a limbo of uncertainty and the Soviet ruble tumbling in decreasing value. As the USSR stumbled politically and financially, it sold seats on its space flights to foreign governments. Furthermore, talks that the USSR might sell the Mir space station were circulating. What that would have meant for the cosmonauts is unclear. They did have one exit option, taking a Soyuz capsule intended for emergencies, but that would have meant leaving Mir to its own fate, most likely an end to the space station. The Mir space station was known to be a confined place, where smells concentrated and noises from machinery never ceased. Several uninvited microorganisms made their home at the station, and the smell inside has been compared to sweat and cognac. Yet Krikalev made the space his own. According to astronaut Sherman, quote, "He always said when we got into the space station, he felt like he was going home." The single window at Mir helped the cosmonauts, and Krikalev particularly, to put up with the months of isolation and low gravity. Quote, "Every spare moment, we tried to look at the Earth." The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics officially fell on December 26, 1991, and the cosmonauts on Mir were one of the last things on the list of priorities for the nations that formed. Volkov had been on board since October 2, 1991, and Krikalev since May 18, 1991. Despite the turmoil below, they had to continue with their daily routines and maintain the station in working condition. About this moment, Krikalev would later state that he questioned himself, quote, "Do I have enough strength? Will I be able to readjust for this longer stay to complete the program?" Naturally, at one point I had my doubts. In January of 1992, they finally received supplies and mail from the transporter Progress M10. After retrieving the contents of the capsule, they reloaded it with data, samples, and results from experiments. The return of Progress M10 was delayed due to issues with the gyroscopes at the stations, but after implementing a spontaneous solution, Progress was sent down to the Kazakhstan steppe on January 20th. 7 days later, they received another supply craft, the M11. While the cosmonauts got impatient for their own return to Earth, the workers at ground control went on a strike to demand better wages. The strike nearly compromised the arrival of M11, but fortunately Krikalev and Volkov were able to coordinate the arrival despite little support on the ground. In February, Krikalev set a new record for the amount of hours spent on an EVA. The cosmonauts' EVA, which focused on inspecting external test objects and modules, got off to a rocky start when Volkov's spacesuit malfunctioned and he was forced to stay in the hatch. Krikalev conducted the necessary repairs to the cover of the Sofura truss structure and other tasks. He spent 4 hours, 12 minutes outside of the station, and by the time he returned, he'd completed 36.5 hours of extravehicular activity. Krikalev's extended stay, however, was about to end. In March of 1992, the first German to travel to Mir was launched on the Soyuz TM-14. German astronaut K.D. Flade stayed with the two cosmonauts for a couple of days, and finally on March 25th, the three of them boarded Soyuz TM-14. Sergei Krikalev landed in the new Republic of Kazakhstan, where he got his first breath of fresh atmospheric air in 312 days. In regards to his arrival, Krikalev has said, quote, "Psychologically, the load was lifted. There was a moment. You couldn't call it euphoria, but it was very good." He was reunited with his young daughter and his wife as he stepped into the Russian Federation for the first time, and had to get a new passport to match his new nationality. The space program he had been working for was now split between Russia's Russian Aviation and Space Agency and Ukraine's National Space Agency of Ukraine. Krikalev was not dissuaded from his passion by the unexpected turn of events that left him in Mir for so long. NASA and Russia sent him on their first joint spaceflight, STS-60, a Discovery shuttle mission. A New York Times article from the time describes him with admiration, quote, "At the age of 35, Sergei K. Krikalev has been an engineer, a daredevil airplane pilot, and an officially designated hero. He has traveled around the world more than 7,000 times. He also went on Expedition 1, the first long-duration mission to the International Space Station. Throughout his life, he logged a total of 803 days, 9 hours, and 40 minutes in space. He received several honors and awards for his role in space exploration, among them the titles of Hero of the Soviet Union and later on, Hero of the Russian Federation." Despite possessing perhaps the most powerful military armament in the world, the United States military has pursued and allegedly continues to pursue diverse warfare options from beyond the physical realm. Among them, a $20 million program to assess possible uses of psychic or extrasensory perception activities, otherwise known as ESPA. Taking place within the Stargate project, many of these trials and tests remained hidden from the general public until the Freedom of Information Act brought them to light in 1995. Among the most prominent of these attempts were remote viewing activities that sought to uncover intelligence from deep within Russia using only the minds of American soldiers stationed in the continental U.S. The idea to integrate extrasensory espionage and psychic warfare techniques into the Army was not a uniquely American project. In fact, the start of this practice may have been traced back to Germany during World War II, when the scientific organization Ahnenerbe, led by Heinrich Himmler, devoted an entire branch to study supernatural phenomena. This secret program was uncovered by the United States during a raid of his property in 1945. It mostly consisted of a collection of magical artifacts collected from conquered nations and peoples, as well as unusual discoveries from archaeological expeditions from around the world. The Soviet Union also happened to gain access to the archives from the project during this time, and so the two new superpowers began fearing what the other may accomplish by studying paranormal and extrasensory activities. While the full degree of seriousness with which the USSR considered these matters is relatively unknown, the intelligence community in the United States did consider the supposed pseudoscientific powers to be a serious matter. One of the few Soviets to rise to prominence with claims of psychic abilities was Nina Kulagina, who had been part of a tank regiment during the Second World War. She was studied by Soviet scientists after allegedly being able to move objects with her mind. The most alarming reports came from a 1970s laboratory experiment, where she supposedly manipulated a frog with her mind, eventually stopping its heart. Many accused her of fraud, and when skeptics reviewed footage of her powers of manipulation, they suggested she was simply relying on tricks. One of the earlier examples of extrasensory activities from the US military took place during the Vietnam War, when some troops took witching rods in an attempt to divine the locations of Viet Cong tunnels. Since the mission was of high priority, and morale was low, the military found it acceptable to integrate this unusual technique for the search. Scientific reasoning was seemingly cast aside during the mission. It's difficult, if not near impossible, to fully assess the success of using witching rods, since many of the tunnels remained hidden, and the ones found were often revealed by a number of coinciding factors. Later, as the fears driven by the space race, Cold War, and new waves of terrorism soon began to take hold of military planners and civilians alike, the question began to arise about whether intelligence agents could use their minds to foresee, prevent, or even counter an attack. In the late 1970s and 80s, the majority of the extrasensory projects that the CIA and Department of Defense delved into sought to test and apply remote viewing, or RV. This type of psychic skill attempts to gather impressions, clues, images, or other information about an unseen, miles-away target through nothing other than mentally applied extrasensory perception. The term remote viewing came from physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ from the Stanford Research Institute, and they worked hard on having it be differentiated from clairvoyance, which was seen as an illegitimate skill at the time. At first, they worked through private funding from the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the Parapsychology Foundation, and their paranormal investigations often focused on test subjects who were perceived to be possessing an innate talent for RV. As the CIA became interested in their work, their operations expanded to official government facilities in collaboration with the intelligence agency. One test subject, a secretary named Rosemary Smith, took part in a small project run within Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. At the time, the US government was looking for a Soviet bomber that had fallen in the African jungle. Satellite images and CIA intelligence had failed to locate the satellite, and in 1976 it was decided to give the RV operation a chance to look for it. Rosemary Smith believed she had psychic powers, and according to journalist Annie Jacobson's book Phenomena, The Secret History of the US Government's Investigations into Extrasensory Perception and Psychokinesis, Rosemary, quote, was able to draw maps that pinpointed where this aircraft was within a few miles. Using this information, she successfully guided a paramilitary unit in the search for the crash site after they found a villager carrying a piece of the aircraft in the area she had pointed them to. Yet not everyone was sold on the idea of funding an extrasensory project for American intelligence. Representative Charles Rose, the chairman of the Intelligence and Oversight House Subcommittee, spoke out about this possibility, saying, quote, "Some of the intelligence people I've talked to know that remote viewing works, although they still block further research on it, since they claim it is not yet as good as satellite photography. But it seems to me that it would be a hell of a cheap radar system. And if the Russians have it and we don't, we're in serious trouble." Following the logic of the congressman, an official extrasensory perception activity operation was launched in October of 1978 on the orders of Major General Edmund Thompson, who genuinely believed in the prospect of the undertaking. Of it, he said, quote, "I never liked to get into debates with skeptics, because if you didn't believe that remote viewing was real, you hadn't done your homework." The project was overseen by Lieutenant Frederick Holmes Atwater, a self-reported psychic headhunter, until 1987, with the understanding that it would be an inexpensive and passive undertaking. The program, codenamed Grill Flame, was carried out at Fort Meade in Maryland. It was run with support from Major General Albert Stubblebine III, who was eventually in full control of the project. Major General Stubblebine strongly believed in the promise of what remote viewing could deliver to the intelligence community. It's thought that it was only because of him that the project survived, since skepticism existed within the military as it transitioned the project out of the budget to make it only a Defense Intelligence Agency endeavor. As stated in a declassified summary released by the CIA from 1981, quote, "Grill Flame is an Army and DIA jointly financed effort to study novel intelligence collection techniques that will help to identify the capabilities and vulnerabilities associated with paranormal phenomenon having military applications." The team of supposedly psychic individuals was small, at no time larger than 20, and worked out of buildings 2560 and 2561 at Fort Meade, as well as makeshift wooden barracks. While many of their practices focused on uncovering Soviet intelligence, they also tried to locate U.S. war prisoners in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, with varying degrees of success. One of the more promising RV sessions happened in September 1979, when the National Security Council asked for information on a naval Soviet base. The viewers were given a sealed envelope containing a photograph of the base. One of the viewers reported mentally accessing images of a building by a shoreline smelling of industrial products. Within the building, he could see a coffin-like weapon which he described as having shark-like fins. Surprisingly, a few months after the experiment, satellite imagery confirmed that the USSR had built a ballistic missile submarine at the base, the Akula, which translated from Russian means shark. This particular incident inspired the book by John Ronson, The Men Who Stare at Goats, and the subsequent film adaptation. Two other high-priority projects that were undertaken by the members of Grill Flame were the attempted location of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi and Manuel Noriega, the military dictator of Panama. As Gaddafi was not captured until the 2011 uprising, it suffices to say that locating him through RV was unsuccessful. As for Noriega, he evaded capture as the members of Grill Flame tried to find him for 3 years. Noriega was only later discovered after he had been granted sanctuary at the Holy See's embassy in Panama. The projects and experiments regarding remote viewing were and continue to be largely criticized for their lack of scientific rigor or support. The viewers were never told whether they had any degree of success, as it was believed that this knowledge might interfere with their morale, and therefore their powers. Throughout its years of activities, the U.S. Extrasensory Project went through several different code names: Scan 8, Grill Flame, Gondola Wish, Center Lane, and Sunstreak, and all of them were later housed under the name Project Stargate. Aside from remote viewing, the participants also delved into psychoenergetics, which seek to affect or communicate with a person, animal, or object placed remotely. The results of RV, psychoenergetics, and other pseudoscientific methods have been questioned, as some of them appear to have been tampered with, rendering them untrustworthy. Adding to the mostly failed attempts at RV, the leadership of the project began to alienate those around them. Stubblebine became increasingly fascinated by more rare and unlikely pseudoscientific possibilities. He would host spoon-bending parties for officers, where alleged telekinetics and psychoenergetics would bend silverware into other shapes. He believed this supposed power could be applied to destroy enemy machinery and weaponry. The Stargate project was terminated in 1995, when the CIA released a report confirming and concluding that no applicable use had been found from these practices for intelligence operations. The release also stated that the data provided by the program was inconclusive, and often vague or irrelevant. The report raised concerns that the leadership of the project may have tampered with the results, so the project could continue. Due to the Freedom of Information Act, most of the documents pertaining to Stargate have been released by the CIA and are accessible to the public, totaling almost 12,500 documents. Yet the United States may not be done with research and development of extrasensory perception activities. In 2014, the Office of Naval Research launched a $3.85 million program to explore intuition, inspired by a number of incidents, including one in 2006 from the Pentagon, claiming that Staff Sergeant Martin Richburg had used it to stop an improvised explosive device. A naval program manager, Commander Joseph Cohn, referred to it in an interview with the New York Times as a sixth sense or spidey sense that alerted them to an impending attack or IED, or that allowed them to respond to a novel situation without consciously analyzing the situation. At the height of the Cold War, Western spy satellites stalking Soviet military installations caught brief glimpses of a warplane that many feared could overwhelm the West's air defenses. Attempts to get details on the build and features of this craft proved futile, posing a dire security risk for anti-Soviet nations. Larger and faster than other military planes at the time, the MiG-25 eluded espionage, capture, and even the imaginations of those who theorized about its capabilities. That was until 1976, when a Soviet pilot aboard one of those most scrutinized but enigmatic aircraft attempted a daring defection from the USSR, bringing with him top-secret military property and offering the West access to both classified enemy technology and prime propaganda. The Soviet Union's Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25 was, by all accounts, an incredible plane. It was big, heavy, and extraordinarily powerful. For some time, it was the envy of Western military powers, especially those of the U.S. Air Force. The first prototype flew in 1964, with the aircraft entering service in 1970. It was designated a supersonic interceptor and reconnaissance aircraft, among the fastest military planes to ever enter service. It had an operational top speed of Mach 2.83, and it was capable of flying in excess of Mach 3 at altitudes few aircrafts could reach. At the time, the technological leap needed to take an aircraft from Mach 2 to Mach 3 had proven to be too enormous of a challenge for the Americans. Flying that fast required engines that generated colossal amounts of thrust, but the USSR had already developed technology that was well suited for the task. The R-15 turbojet was originally intended for a high-altitude cruise missile project, but instead 2 of these were fitted to the new MiG, each one capable of pushing out 11 tons of thrust. At 64 feet long, the MiG-25 was only a few feet shorter than the World War II-era Lancaster bomber. The airframe had to be that size in order to accommodate the engines and to contain the up to 30,000 pounds of fuel needed to power them. Notably, it was one of the few combat planes built primarily using stainless steel, and was the last plane designed by famed Soviet aircraft designer Mikhail Gurevich before his retirement. The entire famous MiG fleet was named after him. With the Soviets' proven track record in military aircraft design, it's no wonder that the West was genuinely worried. Spy satellite footage collected by the West in mid-1970 was the first to pick up evidence of a mysterious new Soviet jet. All the West knew was that it had huge wings and was very fast, at least according to the blurry photographs of it. Nobody knew anything else about it. In Western intelligence circles, the plane was referred to as the Soviet Union's ghost plane, alluding to its almost mythical existence. Another glimpse of the aircraft was recorded in the Middle East. In March 1973, Israel picked up the presence of a plane at the surprising speed of Mach 3.2, more than 3 times the speed of sound. The craft had also climbed to an astounding 63,000 feet. Israeli fighters were scrambled. They tried fruitlessly to intercept the aircraft a few days later. Especially notable for observers was the plane's large wing area, a particular feature useful in fighter planes to help generate lift. In theory, that should have made the MiG-25 more nimble and easier to turn than other fighter jets at the time. To Western intelligence and military experts, the Soviet jet seemed to combine this ability with a pair of enormous engines. How fast could it really go? Could anything in the US Air Force or other Western air forces keep up with it? US defense chiefs were so in the dark about the MiG's supposed capabilities that they codenamed the Soviet aircraft Foxbat, giving it both the letter F designation for fighter and the B designation for bomber. This was the most secretive aircraft project of the USSR up to that time, and competing powers were dying to unveil this Soviet secret. Back in the Soviet Union, fighter pilot Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was a very unhappy man. His home life was falling apart with a looming divorce. He'd also begun to question life in the Soviet system, which he saw as corrupt and not beneficial for ordinary citizens such as him. In despair, he started to think that defecting to the West might be his best option. While training to pilot the new MiG-25 with the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Belenko carefully crafted his plan. A training exercise for a squadron of MiG-25 pilots would take place at the Chugayevka Air Base in Primorsky Krai, near the far eastern Russian city of Vladivostok, on September 6, 1976. Japan was a mere 400 miles away. That day, Belenko had a full tank and a one-way route in mind. In mid-flight, Belenko broke formation and headed for Japan. In order to evade both Soviet and Japanese military radars, he flew just 100 feet above the sea. Once he was far enough into Japanese airspace, he took the MiG up to 20,000 feet so that it could be picked up by a Japanese radar. The Japanese did pick up the plane's presence via their radar system at Chitose Air Base near Sapporo, Hokkaido. The surprised Japanese tried to hail the unidentified aircraft, but Belenko's radio was tuned to the wrong frequencies. 2 Japanese F-4 Phantom fighters were sent up to intercept the mystery plane, but by then Belenko had dropped below the cloud cover. The mystery plane had disappeared from Japanese radar screens. The Soviet pilot spent the entire trip flying by educated guesswork based on his memory of maps he had studied before takeoff. His intention had been to fly the aircraft to the Chitose Air Base, but he started running out of fuel and needed to land at the nearest available airport, Hakodate Airport on Japan's northern island of Hokkaido. He circled the plane over the airport twice and then attempted landing on the airport's concrete and asphalt runway. A drag chute was released in an attempt to slow it down, but unfortunately for him, the runway was not long enough. The jet plowed through hundreds of feet of soil before finally coming to a rest at the far end of the airport. The Japanese on the tarmac and in the control tower were stunned. In the distance was a large, hulking gray warplane with a distinct red star of the Soviet Union on its tail. It was the first MiG-25 stationed, visible, and accessible outside of the USSR. Belenko climbed out of the plane's cockpit and promptly fired 2 warning shots from his pistol. He didn't want anyone approaching his aircraft before he got off. Airport officials driving from the terminal reached him after a few minutes. He offered no resistance to the police who approached them. He did, however, ask the police to cover the plane with a canvas because it contained military secrets. Right then, the 29-year-old pilot announced he wanted to defect. The airport was closed to commercial traffic after Belenko landed. American military personnel were also on the scene almost immediately. The Soviet pilot spent the night at a secret location in the outskirts of Hakodate. The marooned MiG-25 was heavily guarded throughout the night by the police. Hakodate's normally quiet airport had suddenly become a hive of intelligence activity. The Japanese were at first flummoxed as to what to do with the defected Soviet pilot. Japan's foreign ministry began consultation with the United States government at the request of Belenko, since he was seeking asylum in the United States. The Soviet Union was shocked by the defection, and its embassy in Tokyo asked the foreign ministry for permission to interview the pilot. The Japanese military replied that it would have to investigate the incident before making a decision. The Soviet embassy would later demand the immediate return of both plane and pilot. The Japanese politely refused either. Belenko was granted asylum by the United States, and his U.S. citizenship was personally approved by President Jimmy Carter. Early intelligence about the MiG-25 suggested that it easily outclassed existing Western fighters. Western intelligence believed that the Soviets had a highly maneuverable and ridiculously fast secret fighter jet. However, few of its shortcomings were known. The plane was impressive, but not nearly as functional as previously thought. Big and heavy, it wasn't particularly useful in combat. Its handling was considered quite poor, and its range limited due to rapid fuel consumption. The plane's speed turned out to be fast only when flown in a straight line. The MiG's turbojets generated thrust by sucking in air to help burn fuel. At any speed above 2,000 miles per hour, force of the air could overwhelm the fuel pumps. Furthermore, as the plane went above Mach 2.8, the immense force exerted by the compressors could potentially turn the engines inside out, and the plane would literally start sucking up parts of the engine. This explains why MiG-25 pilots were warned never to exceed Mach 2.8, meaning that the MiG at Mach 3.2 tracked by Israeli fighter jets in 1971 likely destroyed its engines while flying. That plane was lucky to return to base. Essentially, the MiG-25 could take off quickly and fly in a straight line very fast to fire missiles or take pictures. On the subject of mistaken military intelligence, U.S. editor of Flight Global, Stephen Trimble, said, quote, "They, meaning American military intelligence, knew it would be very fast and also thought it would be very maneuverable. They were right about the first one, but not about the second one." The U.S. had been hugely spooked by the Soviet plane before Belenko's defection. As a result, the government had revised and accelerated its plans for what would become the F-15 Eagle. Once in circulation, the Eagle would be the world's most formidable air superiority fighter. This American aviation accomplishment was mostly inspired by the imagined necessity to compete with a Soviet plane with extraordinary abilities that only really existed in the misinformed imagination of the intelligence community. Unsurprisingly, the Soviets demanded the return of Belenko's MiG-25. Once inspection of the aircraft concluded, the plane was partly reassembled and shipped back to the USSR in 30 crates. The Japanese then sent the Soviets a US $40,000 bill for shipping costs and for the damage Belenko caused when he landed the plane at Hakodate Airport. Yet pieces from the returned craft were missing. In retaliation to the bill and the partial return, the Soviet Union billed Japan US $10 million. To this day, neither bill has been paid. In 1953, an unidentified and suspicious return appeared on U.S. military radar near Sioux Locks on the border of the U.S. and Canada between Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Whatever it was speeding across the sky at 500 miles per hour, and the Air Force scrambled an F-89C Scorpion interceptor to investigate. As it met the unidentified object on the radar screen, the American plane vanished. No trace of the Scorpion or its two pilots would ever be found. On the evening of November 23, 1953, a mysterious object appeared on the ground intercept radars of the U.S. Air Defense Command at Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan. The target was fast approaching the highly protected Sioux Locks, which were under control of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and still serves today to control vessel traffic between the lower Great Lakes and Lake Superior. Kinross Air Force Base was contacted so the unidentified radar return could be investigated, and an F-89C Scorpion jet was scrambled to intercept. The Scorpion was piloted by First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncla Jr., who had registered a total of 811 flight hours. His onboard radar operator and only other crew member was Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson. As they flew, Wilson reported that he struggled to track down the object because it kept changing course, and ground control had to step in to give additional directions over radio. The pursuit lasted 30 minutes, with the Scorpion giving chase at over 500 miles per hour. Ground operators eventually had them fly lower than 25,000 feet to only 7,000 feet to match the altitude of the unidentified object. The official report of the incident detailed that the weather conditions were not ideal. The Scorpion had a visibility of around 8 to 10 miles in the area, with, quote, moderate to heavy icing in all clouds. Furthermore, the report spoke of scattered snow that moved through the area, temporarily reducing visibility to 1 or 2 miles while in the snow. Yet the air was stable, and no turbulence was expected. As the operators from ground control stared at their radar, the dot representing the Scorpion approached the dot representing the unknown object. At an altitude of 8,000 feet, 70 miles away from Keweenaw Point, and 160 miles to the northwest of Sioux Locks, the Scorpion intercepted the radar return on screen. The radar operators stared attentively at their equipment, waiting for radio communication and confirmation, but the Scorpion was not to be heard from again. The two dots on the radar met and converged. Only one dot was left on the radar, as the radar return from the Scorpion unexpectedly vanished. As stated in the official report, quote, "At approximately 23:52 Zebra, the last radio contact was made by the radar station controlling the interception. At approximately 23:55 Zebra, the unknown aircraft and the F-89 merged together in the radar scope. Shortly thereafter, the IFF signal disappeared from the radar scope. No further contact was established with the F-89. The official report also claims that, quote, "The radar return from the other aircraft indicated it was continuing on its original flight path, while the return from the F-89 disappeared from the GCI station's radar scope. It's been reported, however, that the unknown aircraft actually soon vanished from the range of the radar at great speed, be it by flying off into the distance or flying upwards. The U.S. Air Force conducted a search and rescue effort with support from the U.S. Coast Guard and the Royal Canadian Air Force, but they came back empty-handed. There was no wreckage and no clues as to what had transpired. Worsening weather played a role in limiting more extensive search efforts. The only minor piece of evidence that the U.S. Air Force eventually uncovered came from another Scorpion pilot who gave testimony to the accident board that Moncla had activated his radio transmission briefly, directing it at him 40 minutes past the incident. The claim could not be confirmed, nor did it provide any helpful information. News of the incident was released to the public through the Associated Press, stating that the jet, quote, was followed by radar until it merged with an object 70 miles off Keweenaw Point in Upper Michigan. The unusually forthcoming statement made it clear they did not know what the object was. But later, the U.S. Air Force changed its tune. In a follow-up statement, they claimed the Scorpion had approached the unidentified flying object, which turned out to be nothing more than a Canadian C-47 plane off its course, flying over the Sioux Locks by accident. This version made it to the official report. Quote, the unknown aircraft being intercepted was a Royal Canadian Air Force Dakota C-47, serial number VC-912, flying from Winnipeg to Sudbury, Canada. At the time of interception, it was crossing northern Lake Superior from west to east at 7,000 feet. According to statements released before the report, the C-47 was prompted to change its direction, which it did, and the Scorpion dove into the lake on its return to the Kinross Air Force Base. Under these assumptions, it was officially reported that Lieutenant Moncla suffered from vertigo, or spatial disorientation, and that he, in all likelihood, crashed the plane into the lake. Contrary to these assertions, however, Canadian officials denied that their Air Force or any of their planes had been involved in the incident. They had no registered flights in the area that night. The Royal Canadian Air Force firmly refuted that the intercepted object was one of their planes. In response, the U.S. Air Force amended their statement on the matter once they released the official report. In it, they detailed that the Canadian pilot was not contacted at the time, but only after the fact. The amended report further clarified that the pilot had not been aware he was being intercepted and that he had not seen the Scorpion. This written account could not be corroborated against any Canadian records, and no pilot has come forth claiming to have been the one involved. This has made many believe that in fact no such Canadian pilot exists. To make matters even murkier, a 1973 book by Donald Kehoe, a retired Marine Corps major, investigated the incident, among other unidentified flying object reports, and claimed that officers from the Air Force gave Moncla's widow, Bobby Jean Coleman, two different versions of the event. Their first version held that Moncla had dived into the lake because he was flying too low, but their second version was that a malfunction made the jet explode at a high altitude. The second explanation contradicts both the official report's claims of the altitude at which the plane flew and the claim that a theoretical Canadian pilot somehow didn't notice the Scorpion. Due to the Air Force's inconsistent narrative and unsuccessful attempt at establishing an official sequence of events explaining what they reported as, quote, an accident, civilians across the United States drew their own conclusions. The Air Force's offered explanation as to why the Scorpion disappeared from the radar due to atmospheric conditions was also either ignored or scoffed at by members of the press and public. To many, it made no sense that the Scorpion would disappear due to a radar malfunction while the unidentified object remained visible on screen. If indeed at the bottom of the lake, reaching the crash site would be nearly impossible due to the depth of the water in the area and the lack of exact coordinates to the supposed accident site. With no wreck to be found, many civilian investigators have pursued their own theories as to what has come to be known as the Kinross UFO incident. One of these theories posits that the Scorpion and its crew could have been captured by an unknown craft in an experimental operation. Another theory suggests that the Scorpion may have impacted an unknown aircraft being tested in the area. These UFO theories were strengthened when in 2006, Adam Jimenez from the Great Lakes Dive Company reported to the media that he and his team had located the airplane wreck and a metallic section of a flying disc underwater. In October of 1968, a Sioux Daily Star article reported that two prospectors located the tail section and other aircraft parts possibly belonging to the lost Scorpion jet on the eastern shore of Lake Superior. In another article from the same publication, it was reported that U.S. Air Force Major J.H. Parker from the Kincheloe Air Base confirmed that at least a stabilizer, which was among the recovered parts, came from a military jet. After that confirmation, no more information on the origin of the aircraft parts was published. The Government of Canada has stated that it has no record of this discovery or the results that came with it. Then came the Great Lakes Dive Company claims of 2006. In August of that year, UFO researcher Francis Ridge received an email from Preston Miller quoting an Associated Press story that said the company divers had found the lost Scorpion jet. They claimed that the wreck was in the depths of Lake Superior, close to where the jet had disappeared from the radar screen. Miller's email included a link to the Great Lakes Dive Company website. Ridge posted the email in relevant forums, prompting online curiosity. Reporters reached out to the company and were put in contact with their spokesman, Adam Jimenez. He spoke to multiple journalists and completed interviews, including one with UFO researcher Linda Moulton Howe for the nationally syndicated show Coast to Coast AM. Once again, the Kinross UFO incident had captured the public's attention. On their website, the company posted 2 images of the discovery taken from a side-scan sonar. These were fuzzy images showing an almost intact aircraft, easily identifiable, lying on the lakebed. Next to it was a teardrop-shaped metallic object, perhaps proof of an experimental craft. The mystery had been solved, or so some thought. Journalists and self-reported UFO experts began raising their concerns and poking holes in the claims. Jimenez was willing to talk about the discovery for non-presential viewers, but would not reveal details such as the vessel used, company details, or evidence of previous excursions. Some claims made by the company were straight-out falsehoods, such as a statement that blamed the Canadian government for blocking further surveying of the crash site, which was impossible because no one had ever even requested to survey that particular area. Deeper investigations found no previous history of the Great Lakes Dive Company, and the director of the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History said he had never heard of the group, nor had any of his associates. The only contact information ever given by the company was the email address and cell phone of Adam Jimenez. When his name was inputted in databases in search of biographical data, no related results came out. A subsequent investigation by the MUFON, an international UFO research civilian organization based in the US, concluded that the Associated Press story was fake and had been drafted by Preston Miller, if he even existed. In-depth investigations seemed to conclude that Adam Jimenez did not exist, and neither did the Great Lakes Dive Company. Only 3 weeks after claiming the discovery, the company's website vanished from the internet, and Adam Jimenez dropped all correspondence, his cell phone disconnected. On the other hand, Brendan Baylod, director of the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History and a Great Lakes shipwreck hunter, has stated that the side-scan images are authentic, albeit either made with a tow fish rather than a fish finder, or closer to the surface than the 500 feet or 150 meters claimed by Jimenez. The scan was never linked to an actual location. Located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, over 6,000 miles from the continental United States, is a massive and dangerous vault with some of the most contaminated radioactive material on Earth. The Tomb on Ruined Island, as it's often called, contains the debris of 43 nuclear bomb tests conducted by the U.S. on the Inuiatak Atoll of the Marshall Islands, as well as 130 tons of radioactive soil shipped from the Nevada test site. Already, cracks can be seen on top of the dome, and chunks of broken concrete rest in black water, accumulating at its base. As sea levels rise, the entire tomb now threatens to crumble into the ocean. By the late 1940s, nuclear testing was already increasingly being perceived as a public health threat. Concerns continued to grow until the 1956 presidential election, when ending all nuclear testing was debated in U.S. politics, and safety from radiation was adopted as a key policy. By June of the same year, the National Academy of Sciences was calling for new exposure limits to radiation, which the Atomic Energy Commission agreed to. Yet the nuclear test projects Operation Plum Bob, Project 58 or 58A, and Operation Hardtack 1 were already in the making. Operation Plum Bob consisted of 29 explosions at the Nevada test site and was the biggest and longest test series to take place in the continental United States. Project 58 or 58A and Operation Hardtack 1 were scheduled to follow, but changes with Project 5858A and developments in the Soviet Union changed the testing landscape significantly. In December of 1957, one of the 4 Project 5858A tests went terribly wrong, producing an unexpected 500-ton nuclear blast that delivered low levels of radiation to the city of Los Angeles in the form of a radiation fallout cloud. Public alarm led President Eisenhower to demand that the Operation Hardtack 1 test scheduled to follow be shorter and more limited to fewer than 25 shots. On the other side of the world, the USSR was also pushing for a joint moratorium on nuclear testing, having felt public pressure themselves over nuclear proliferation and rising global radiation levels. In fact, in July of 1958, President Nikita Khrushchev met with President Eisenhower to discuss the technicalities and negotiate a path towards ending nuclear testing. When President Eisenhower announced the resulting ban that was scheduled to begin on October 31st of that same year, American scientists begged for Operation Hardtack 1 to be expanded before testing was halted. Their pleas were heard, and the number of tests was significantly increased. Between 1946 and 1962, the United States conducted extensive nuclear bomb tests on, over, and in the Pacific Ocean, using the Marshall Islands as primary testing ground. Over 100 bombs were detonated, with the largest test series, Operation Hardtack 1, beginning in 1958 and producing 35 blasts that totaled 35.6 megatons. These tests were performed by Joint Task Force 7, a combination of 19,100 people, both military elements and civilian workers, from the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission. More nuclear weapons were launched in the Pacific during this operation than there had been in the tally of all previous explosions in the Pacific. Aside from seeking to gather as much data as possible before the moratorium on testing, these tests were intended to provide more information on how to develop superior nuclear weapons. 3 tests were conducted in the atmosphere, with the intention of studying how nuclear blasts would affect materials and electronics, as well as to measure the energy released in the forms of output. The first of these tests, Yucca, was carried out close to Enewetak Atoll, while the other 2, Teak and Orange, were relocated further away to Johnston Island after it was feared the tests would be so bright that they would cause retinal damage to the native islanders. When Teak was detonated, it provoked the first man-made electromagnetic pulses at high altitude, seen as an aurora visible all the way from Hawaii. Radio communications shut down all across the Pacific, with Hawaii experiencing a 2-hour blackout and Australia a long 9-hour blackout. Other Hardtack 1 tests were performed underwater and from barges on the ocean surface to see how much explosions could damage Navy boats. Most of these were performed at Enewetak because the bottom of the sea was relatively uniform in that area, which allowed for ships to be secured to the sea floor. During these tests, it was observed that when bubbles formed from the heat of the explosion burst after quickly cooling down, the water rushing back into the cavity became part of a, quote, radioactive pool of highly concentrated radioactive fallout. Sensors that studied the explosions were placed on everything from target boats to balloons. 4 more hardtack tests were performed on the ground of the atoll itself: Cactus, Kinsey, Fig, and Koa. These tests sought to measure the amount of radioactive earthen materials cast into the atmosphere. The Cactus test was carried out on May 6, 1958, detonating 18 kilotons at a northern point of Runit Island. The 350-foot wide crater left behind by Cactus would eventually come to serve as the location for the radioactive tomb. The cloud from the blast reached as high as 19,000 feet, 5.79 kilometers, with the fallout tested by rockets and B-57D and WB-50 aircraft. Kinsey and Fig were also conducted at the center of Runit, while Koa was tested on and completely obliterated the smaller island of Dridrobui. As testing from Operation Hardtack 1 wrapped, the U.S. Defense Nuclear Agency began an 8-year-long cleanup program to deal with the radioactive fallout. Unfortunately, the U.S. Congress did not allocate the necessary funds for a full decontamination program that would have made the atoll habitable again, and the preferred option for disposing of nuclear waste, deep ocean dumping, was forbidden by treaties and regulations. And radioactive material was not all that the U.S. had to dispose of. For Operation Speckled Start in 1968, the Army tested Staphylococcal enterotoxin B, one of the most toxic bacterial agents that was tested primarily for weaponizing. The agent causes inflammation and release of cytokine, which affects the immune system. Common consequences of exposure are toxic shock, asthma, nasal polyps, and atopic dermatitis. The atoll had been sprayed with the chemical, ground zero being Lojua Island, with a single test potentially reaching 926.5 square miles. Results from these tests established a potential 30% casualty rate. The U.S. conducted about a dozen experiments with chemical weapons such as this one. Without the necessary funds to carry out a complete cleanup of the mess they left behind, the U.S. instead looked into a temporary solution. Over $600 million was allocated to relocate the local native communities that were threatened by the dangerous radiation. It was further decided that a containment chamber would be built to hide a significant portion of the remaining nuclear and biological waste. To begin work on the dome, American service people scraped off 3 to 5 inches of radioactive soil from the islands and mixed it with 130 tons of contaminated irradiated soil shipped from the Nevada test site. Plans called for dumping the slurry of contamination inside the crater left by the Cactus explosion. According to the Defense Nuclear Agency report titled The Radiological Cleanup of Enewetak Atoll in 1981, quote, after much consideration, the director of the Defense Nuclear Agency decided in early 1975 that the only generally acceptable method for disposing of contaminated debris and soil from the Enewetak cleanup project was by mixing it with cement and placing it in recoverable storage in La Crosse and, if necessary, Cactus craters. In order to develop the formulas for the soil cement mixtures and the slurry of waste, the U.S. called on members of the Army Corps of Engineers Waterways Experiment Station to assist the mission. With the limited funds allocated, the U.S. only managed to thoroughly clean 3 of the 40 islands. Enyebi, which served as a residential island for a little over half of the Inuiatak population, was not among those cleaned. The crater itself was sealed with concrete, resulting in the Runit Dome, often referred to as the Tomb. With a diameter of 115 meters or 377 feet, it holds an estimated 3.1 million cubic feet of radioactive waste, including amounts of plutonium-239 that would be lethal if they ever escaped their confines. The size of this massive dome covers the equivalent of 35 Olympic swimming pools. Resettlement of the northern part of the atoll was cancelled due to rising costs, but in 1972 the U.S. started extending invitations for displaced residents of Inuiatak to return to their islands for the first time. In the 1980s, as the U.S. departed the Marshall Islands, hundreds of people flocked back to them. In the report published by the Defense Nuclear Agency, it stated that unfortunately, quote, if there was an evident shortcoming in the construction portion of the project, it was in the quality control standards and procedures for the Cactus Crater container. Disturbingly, it's been expressed by scientists that there's also an interest in collecting data on the effects of radiation on people, which may have played a part in the relocation strategies. In fact, industrial hygienist for the Atomic Energy Commission, Meryl Eisenbud, stated, quote, while it is true that these people do not live the way that Westerners do, civilized people, it is nonetheless true that they are more like us than the mice. The Runit Dome has been subject to much controversy in recent times, as it was never meant to be a permanent solution, and weathering due to climate change has begun to form cracks in the dome. The floor of the dome was never sealed with concrete, and high tide now regularly reaches the base and penetrates underneath. Michael Gerard, founder and director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, stated in a Los Angeles Times article that, quote, more than any other place, the Marshall Islands is a victim of the 2 greatest threats facing humanity, nuclear weapons and climate change, and that, quote, the United States is entirely responsible for the nuclear testing there, and its emissions have contributed more to climate change than those from any other country. The government of the Marshall Islands made a compact with the U.S. in 1986, establishing that the former would receive $2.3 billion to resolve property and health damages that would liberate America from any more liability claims. However, at the time, the United States withheld vital information about the extent of radiation and the fact that it had tested biological weapons from the Marshallese people and government. Furthermore, American courts and Congress have refused to allocate the funds, with only $4 million being paid. Finally, a 2013 report from the American Department of Energy found that nuclear waste in the soil and lagoon around the Runit Dome had a greater concentration of radioactivity than the dome itself, since the cleaning operation had removed a mere 0.8% of nuclear waste in the atoll. As for the Runit Dome, even those who built it had little faith in the project. Within the tomb, workers are said to have left behind a small monument. If the dome were ever to collapse, the world might see a sculpture of a middle finger, known as the Runit Salute. Operation Ivy Bells challenged the U.S. Navy to use top-of-the-line technology in order to wiretap underwater communication cables found within the USSR's territorial waters. The innovative USS Halibut submarine took divers on a mission so secret that most of the crew involved were not told the truth about what they were doing. The U.S. collected over 10 years of valuable recordings until an American veteran betrayed his country for $35,000 from the KGB. The USS Halibut was a unique espionage submarine used for many top-secret missions throughout the Cold War. The 350-foot-long nuclear-powered machine was similar to the Sailfish-class radar picket subs, but had more storage space and could submerge deeper into the ocean with an underwater speed of over 20 knots, thanks to its S-3W nuclear reactor, which also gave the submarine unlimited range. The USS Halibut was used as a Regulus submarine for 4 years, before the Navy placed it in a dry dock at Pearl Harbor to update it and prepare it for special operations. $70 million later, the submarine featured diver hatches, a photography darkroom, and thrusters for keeping a stationary position. A subsequent update in 1968 at Mare Island saw the installation of video and photo equipment, tapping and recording equipment, and saturation diving equipment meant to prevent nitrogen narcosis in divers. More importantly, USS Halibut was adapted to operate 2 remote vehicles called Fish, with a storage bay going by the nickname of the Bat Cave, and a top-of-the-line mainframe computer for analysis of sensor data. The Fish could swim down to 20,000 feet and were equipped with cameras, a sonar, and strobe lights. After the changes, the USS Halibut was assigned to the Deep Submergence Group as a nuclear attack submarine, rather than a nuclear-guided missile one. The United States had a particular interest in learning about the Soviet Union's intercontinental ballistic missiles and their nuclear arsenal's preemptive strike capabilities. Development of defensive strategies and mechanisms was essential. After the early 1970 discovery of an undersea communication cable used by Russia to link the Soviet Pacific Fleet Petropavlovsk base to the Vladivostok headquarters, tapping it became incredibly enticing. The cable was located in the depths of the Sea of Okhotsk, between Russian mainland and the Kamchatka Peninsula. However, access to the sea was limited for non-Soviet vessels since the Socialist Republic claimed it as territorial waters. The Soviet Navy had even installed devices at the bottom of the sea, monitoring sound to detect intrusion attempts. The challenge was only increased by the novelty of the necessary technology. In her book Blind Man's Bluff, Sherry Sontag stated, quote, "No one else was doing underwater cable tapping. This was all brand new." U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence Undersea Warfare Director James F. Bradley entered the post in 1966. After discovering the existence of the Soviet underwater communications network, he decided to tap it. However, the Soviets could not learn about the mission, or else it would be compromised. By the time the mission was ready to be launched in the fall of 1971, the Navy had come up with a cover story that was followed through. To justify sending the USS Halibut submarine to the Sea of Okhotsk, they claimed it would be searching for and retrieving the remains of a Soviet SSN-12 Sandbox supersonic anti-ship missile for development of countermeasures. Committing to the narrative, U.S. divers collected over 2 million pieces of debris from one of the missiles and took them back to the Naval Research Laboratory for reconstruction. After reverse engineering the missile from its remains, the researchers were actually surprised to discover it was only radar-guided, rather than using the infrared technology they assumed it had. The front for Operation Ivy Bells actually turned out to be useful by itself. The changes made to the USS Halibut were at least partially the result of discovering the Soviet communications cable. The potential for gathering intelligence was far too tempting for the Navy to let the opportunity pass by. Captain James F. Bradley Jr. devoted a great part of his time and energy to ensuring that Operation Ivy Bells could be carried out by the end of 1971. He was convinced the Soviet cable was vulnerable and unencrypted because the depth at which it was found and its proximity to the Russian mainland had served as sufficient defense. He knew that a mission to wiretap the cable would be so risky, technologically challenging, and daring that the Soviets could not possibly conceive it. Relying partially on the technologies made by the Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle program of the Navy and secretly redirecting funds intended for that program, he funded the updates to the USS Halibut, giving it the Batcave and fishes needed for the mission. Yet Captain Bradley still faced the challenge of ensuring his team could succeed at such a depth in enemy waters. He developed the fake mission goal, which actually had to be completed in order to use it as a convincing front. He was then tasked with figuring out how to send divers 400 feet below the surface for multiple hours. The answer lay in saturation diving. By mixing helium and oxygen, divers would be able to stay underwater for longer at deeper depths without suffering from nitrogen narcosis, which happens when nitrogen and oxygen compress due to water pressure, and the buildup of nitrogen in the bloodstream causes a range of symptoms that can end in fatal embolisms. The success of this method, rooted in the lower molecular weight of helium in contrast to nitrogen, represented one of the very first instances of saturation diving, which the Soviets could have hardly anticipated. The next issue on the agenda was establishing the precise location of the 600,000 square mile long cable. It's been reported that Captain Bradley referred to his childhood memories of utility line warning signs posted by the Mississippi River. He was convinced that the Soviets would post similar signs to prevent accidental damage to the cable by fishermen boats and other civilian vessels. His presumption was correct. After arriving at the Sea of Okhotsk in October of 1971, the crew members of USS Halibut located warning signs for fishermen along the shoreline, indicating the area where the cable was. In order to tap the cable without compromising it, they used an induction technique, placing a 20-foot-long apparatus around the 5-inch width of the cable without cutting into it. Additionally, the wiretapping instrument was designed to detach in case the cable was brought to the surface for repairs. The mission was successfully accomplished, with its actual purpose remaining a secret for most of the sailors on board the USS Halibut, since they lacked the security clearance and were only told of the cover story. Starting in October 1971, the Navy sent divers monthly to retrieve and replace the recording tapes. The recordings would be handed over to the National Security Agency for analysis. The mission was so successful that the U.S. continued to tap Soviet lines around the globe. AT&T's Bell Laboratories even improved their instruments and created nuclear-powered devices that could gather data from an entire year. While the USS Halibut continued to be operated for these types of missions, other submarines were also used, including the USS Parch, USS Richard B. Russell, and the USS Seawolf, which was almost lost during a tape collection as it was stranded at the bottom of the ocean following a storm and was almost self-destructed to scuttle the ship and the crew. The US was able to collect almost 10 years of Soviet communications. Some have credited the findings for de-escalating the Cold War, as the United States realized just how afraid the Soviets had become of an American-instigated attack against them. Navy access to these communication cables was lost when a desperately indebted NSA veteran sold its secrets. Ronald Pelton, then 44, filed for personal bankruptcy and 3 months later resigned from the National Security Agency. Fluent in Russian and familiar with Operation Ivy Bells, Pelton was highly qualified to conduct espionage for the Russians. He was reportedly in $65,000 of debt, which would equate to around $200,000 in today's market. Out of options, he traveled to the Washington, D.C. Russian embassy at the beginning of 1980 and offered to reveal the NSA's secrets for a substantial amount. After talks, the KGB paid him $35,000 for 3 years of service. Additionally, he was compensated $5,000 specifically for details on Operation Ivy Bells. Throughout his treasonous employment, Pelton never provided the Soviets with any classified documents, but rather relayed what he knew from memory. The KGB did not respond immediately to Pelton's revelations of wiretapping, perhaps while debating how exactly to respond, if at all. In 1981, Soviet warships traveled to the tap site in the Sea of Okhotsk. This was revealed to the NSA by satellite imaging. The Navy immediately sent the USS Parch to recover the wiretapping device and recordings, but by the time it arrived, the machine was gone. In November of 1985, after 25 years of service, KGB Colonel Vitaly Irchenko defected from the USSR after telling his CIA guard, quote, "I'm going for a walk. If I don't come back, it's not your fault." He was only gone for a couple of days, during which he provided the CIA with several espionage leads, among them Pelton's activities. He returned to the Soviet Union, claiming that Americans had kidnapped him and forced him to talk. Pelton was arrested and convicted to 3 concurrent life sentences in 1986, which meant he would serve them simultaneously under the Espionage Act of 1917. He was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, and moved to a halfway house for the last 6 months of his incarceration. In November of 2015, he was released on parole after 30 years in prison. As for the Operation Ivy Bells recording device taken by the USSR, it resurfaced for a display at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Moscow. A military experiment was about to begin in USSR territory. The Army was conducting ground, air, and sea operations to ensure its total secrecy. Everything seemed on track along the Soviet border when a mysterious foreign aircraft was spotted near Sakhalin Island, north of Japan. After futile attempts to establish contact with the unknown aircraft, Major Gennady Osipovich, aboard his Su-15 fighter, was assigned to take it down. Recent reports of U.S. recon planes scouting the zone put the USSR under alarm. It was not about to allow the secret military project to be compromised. When Major Osipovich approached the unidentified aircraft to fire warning shots, no response came from the plane. Instead, it suddenly began to climb, slowing its speed, as if it wanted to avoid contact and flee. After a moment of hesitation, fearing that the enemy airplane would escape with valuable intel, Major Osipovich was given permission to open fire and take it down no matter the cost. With an audacious maneuver, he fired 2 AA-3 air-to-air missiles. One of them exploded behind the target, damaging a crucial control line. The second one hit the aircraft in the fuselage. Major Osipovich radioed command that the enemy recon plane was destroyed, and he safely returned to base. The sky was clear, and the USSR's secrets were safe. But to Major Osipovich's disgrace, neither he nor the Russian command knew that they had just taken down a civilian aircraft, carrying more than 250 innocent people aboard. The consequences of this action would put the world on the brink of nuclear war once again. The Russians would claim it was a setup and a deliberate political provocation, while the US would condemn it as a cruel act of barbarism. Intelligence gathered later demonstrated that there was more to the story than a simple unidentified aircraft flying across Russian territory. The Korean Airlines Flight 007 incident would be considered one of the final denouements of Cold War fear before the USSR finally crumbled in 1991. On an August night in 1983, at JFK Airport in New York, 269 passengers and crew, including 62 Americans, said goodbye to their families before boarding Korean Airlines Flight 007 for Seoul, South Korea. A U.S. Congressman, Republican Larry McDonald, was also on board. After taking off from New York, the Boeing 747 jumbo jet stopped at Anchorage for a refuel on August 31st. At 4 a.m., the aircraft took off full of passengers, crew, cargo, and fuel. At 1,000 feet, KAL 007 turned to the left and began its flight heading to the west. To reach Seoul safely, KAL 007 received precise air traffic control instruction. The airplane was to fly directly to the Bethel Navigational Waypoint and follow the transoceanic track R20. They set the autopilot accordingly. For the first minutes of the flight, the aircraft made its way across the sea according to the instructions. However, as time passed, KAL 007 started to deviate slightly to the north of its planned route. With every mile passed, the airplane's real-time location and the intended course to Seoul deviated further. When KAL 007 reached the oceanic waypoint Navy at about 200 miles off the Alaskan coast, the flight was already 100 miles off track. For the captain and the rest of the crew, everything seemed normal. Yet KAL 007 slowly began to make its way through Siberia. An hour later into the flight, the airplane entered airspace heavily monitored by the USSR. Coincidence or not, a USAF Boeing RC-135 happened to be in the same area observing Soviet military activities. The Soviets were conducting a top-secret missile test at the Kura Missile Test Range. The Boeing RC-135 was the military model of the civilian Boeing 707. From a distance, both aircraft looked similar, except the RC-135 was equipped with listening devices and equipment explicitly tailored for reconnaissance missions. When KAL 007 entered the zone, the USAF Boeing RC-135 was flying in wide circles in the Kamchatka Peninsula, where the USSR had installed military radars to track any activities in the Bering Sea. The USAF flight was continually coming in and out of Soviet radar range to track and monitor its communications. During one of these maneuvers, KAL 007 entered the Soviet radar range zone while the USAF's recon plane was coming out. From this moment on, KAL 007 began to be tracked and hunted by Soviet radar operators. They erroneously believed that that aircraft was the U.S. Air Force Boeing 707 they had been monitoring for several hours. For the crew and passengers aboard KAL 007, the flight was running smoothly. They were on schedule, and as far as they knew, they were on course. It was night outside, and although the sky was clear, everything was dark below them. 2 hours into the flight, the passengers were awakened by a crew member who told them over the intercom that they would arrive on time to Seoul. His last words were, quote, "Before landing, we will be serving beverages and breakfast. Thank you." But there would be no landing. In the meantime, the USSR dispatched 4 MiG-23 fighters to intercept KAL 007. The Soviet aircraft initiated a pursuit through the region that ended without contact. They had to return to base for refueling. Miraculously, KAL 007 made its way to the Sea of Okhotsk. They stayed relatively safe in these international waters until it headed again into Soviet territory near Sakhalin Island, a 500-mile-long archipelago at the north of Japan. KAL-007 had now deviated from its destination by more than 200 miles. Russian officials from the Dolinsk-Sokol airbase dispatched 2 Sukhoi Su-15 fighter jets to contact the unidentified aircraft. Gennady Osipovich was one of the 2 Soviet pilots. Recalling what happened that day, he told CNN in 1998 that when he approached KAL-007, quote, "I could see 2 rows of windows which were lit up. I wondered if it was a civilian aircraft. Military cargo planes don't have such windows." He doubted if it was the USAF's recon plane, but said, quote, "I wondered what kind of plane it was, but I had no time to think. I had a job to do. I started to signal the captain in international code. I informed him that he had violated our airspace. He did not respond. Along with him, the other Soviet pilot, Lieutenant General Valentin Voronikov, fired warning shots with lit tracers. Still, the crew from KAL-007 ignored the message or did not see them. Osipovich thought that was strange. They did not respond to any of the 2 warnings. He tried to make radio contact with the aircraft, but no one answered. It was their 3rd and last opportunity to respond, and they refused to do so. Suddenly, KAL-007 began to ascend. According to the conversation the crew had with Tokyo Area Control Center, the move was apparently for fuel purposes. However, the 2 Soviet pilots behind the aircraft took this as an act of defiance. Meanwhile, Russian command debated if the plane was indeed an enemy or not. Some officers wished to wait until the airplane was adequately identified, but others urged command to take it down immediately. They believed the plane could not be civilian because it purposely flew over Russian airspace on repeated occasions and failed to respond to warning shots. It could only be a spy plane. Seconds later, command took a desperate decision and radioed Osipovich, ordering him to, quote, "destroy the intruder." And Osipovich did so without hesitation. He fired 2 air-to-air missiles before KAL-007 made it into international airspace again. Osipovich would conclude the interview with CNN by saying, quote, "My orders were to destroy the intruder. I fulfilled my mission." KAL-007 was able to fly for 15 minutes after it was hit by the Soviet aircraft. The airplane crashed in the sea, near Monoron Island, west of Sakhalin. When the news reached the U.S., President Reagan called the attack, quote, "a savagery, an act worthy of barbarians, and a crime against humanity." On September 5th, President Reagan addressed the country and played an intercepted audio tape of Osipovich's discussions with Russian officials, including a portion where Osipovich mentioned the airplane's blinking light. According to an article by Tom Patterson and published by CNN, Reagan said, quote, "A Boeing 747 airliner is a distinctive shape. It looks nothing like a U.S. military spy plane. There's no way a pilot could mistake this for anything other than a civilian airliner." The Soviets refused to acknowledge shooting down the aircraft until September 6th. Soviet Secretary General Yuri Andropov accused the U.S. of a political setup. Quote, "A sophisticated provocation, masterminded by the U.S. Special Services with the use of a South Korean plane." Soviet interference continued during the search and recovery efforts, as naval forces harassed the international mission to find the crash site. No passengers were recovered in the first days after the incident, and to many, it seemed like the Soviets were eager to keep it that way. It was not until wreckage began washing up in Japan 8 days later that the Soviet conspiracy theories began falling apart. After the USSR's fall, Boris Yeltsin, Russia's new president, released Kremlin documents related to KAL-007 in 1992. He provided the airplane's black boxes that Russian officials recovered from the crash, giving the public more knowledge about what truly happened. Despite the Soviet fighter pilot reports, there was little to confirm that the Soviets actually tried to contact KAL-007 or that they even fired warning shots. Intercepted radio traffic also seemed to suggest that the Soviet fighters were instructed to shoot the plane down, even if it was over neutral waters. Regarding the strange and erroneous flight route, studies conducted later by the International Civil Aviation Organization concluded that it was an autopilot error. Although the crew was experienced, when they set the autopilot mode, it was probably in heading mode. According to author Asaf Dagani, a former NASA expert, such a setting prompted the plane to, quote, follow a course according to the magnetic compass, which can vary in accuracy up to 15 degrees at high altitudes. A Soviet defector also provided information outlining many embarrassing command and control errors that likely led to the botched Soviet response to the civilian airliner incursion. A major Soviet radar installation had been out of service for several days, allowing KAL-007 to reach Soviet airspace without being noticed earlier. The initial pursuit's failure ratcheted up pressure on the second Soviet pilot's dispatch to identify the plane. Later interviews suggest that the pilots did believe KAL-007 could have been civilian, and even saw its windows. They did not communicate this to the ground controllers. A 1993 Russian report eventually revealed that KAL-007 was likely shot down in international airspace before it crashed in Soviet territorial waters. Aides rush in and out of the White House Situation Room, swarming around the map of Berlin spread across the table before President John F. Kennedy. All eyes carefully assess the markers in the city's layout, indicating the division between the west and east, and the area where two opposing lines of tanks stand facing each other. Tensions between the Soviets and Americans have reached a climax at Checkpoint Charlie. Any misstep could spell doom for the entire world. As Kennedy and his allies weigh risks and alternatives, an obscure document makes it to the president's desk. The words on the page describe an attack unlike anything the U.S. has ever launched. A strike so brutal that Kennedy himself becomes uneasy just by reading it. The idea is almost immediately discarded, but then intelligence of a Soviet bomb detonating in Europe arrives. The tested weapon has unleashed an explosion hundreds of times stronger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The Americans are forced to reassess their lethal plan, bringing the world one step closer to the age of nuclear war. The fall of Berlin. Berlin's spiral into the epicenter of one of the most critical encounters of the Cold War began with the waving of a Soviet flag atop the hollowed-out Reichstag in May 1945. This German governmental building had been one of the last remaining symbols of Nazi power as the empire of the Third Reich came crumbling down. In the last months of the war, the entire city of Berlin trembled under a Soviet barrage as the Red Army's forces surged forward. 2.5 million soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged into the city, reducing it to rubble. Streets burned, landmarks fell, and the air echoed with artillery fire as the final strike to the Nazi regime was dealt. From the depths of his Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler, once the master of a continent, stood powerless. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich had come to an end. Facing inevitable defeat, he took his own life before watching his beloved capital fall into enemy hands, leaving his loyal followers to fend for themselves in a collapsing city. But victory came at a price. The Soviet occupation of Berlin marked the beginning of a new era, not one of peace, but of division. As World War II ground to its conclusion, Germany was carved into 4 occupation zones, divided among the victors: France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, deep within the Soviet sector, was itself split. As Allied soldiers celebrated their hard-won victory, few could grasp the dark clouds already forming over the city that had just been freed from the Nazis. Tensions start. With Hitler out of the way, Western allies and the Soviet Union could see each other for what they were once again: ideological enemies. Ruptures didn't take long to crack their fragile partnership, each side procuring its own goals before capitulating to the other. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, Berlin became a precious commodity neither Americans nor Soviets were willing to concede, turning the city into a shared battleground. For the Soviets, the Americans were no more than capitalist intruders in the heart of East Germany, and forcing them out quickly became a priority for the Soviet Party. In 1948, leader Joseph Stalin made the first move by launching the Berlin blockade, severing all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin in a bid to starve the city into submission. Faced with a nearly impossible choice, risk war to break the blockade or retreat and abandon Berlin, the Western Allies opted for a third option the Soviets weren't accounting for. Back in Western Europe, American and British aircraft loaded with essential supplies began taking off the runway toward Berlin. The Berlin airlift was a risky operation, flying past the blockade established by Stalin and keeping the western part of the city alive at any cost. Every flight risked sparking a Soviet attack, yet the Allies pressed on as West Berliners began taking the streets, massive protests forming against the totalitarian Soviet regime seeking to consume the entire city at any cost. For the Americans, this was a victory, and despite there being no viable way to defend their portion of the city through military efforts, keeping the Germans on their side became an effective cultural weapon against a nation that was quickly turning into their greatest enemy. Stalin's forces could only sit and watch as planes came to land at Tempelhof Airport every 45 seconds. Incapable or unwilling to strike them down, they had no choice but to lift the blockade in May of 1949. Yet, far from admitting defeat before the Americans, this only prompted the Soviets to take their game one step further. The wall goes up. In the early summer of 1961, East German leader Walter Ulbricht proclaimed confidently, quote, "Nobody intends to build a wall." Yet, on August 13th, Berliners awoke to a dystopia. Barbed wire barricades slashed across the city, severing streets and neighborhoods in a single night. Families were torn apart, friends abruptly separated, and colleagues found themselves stranded on opposite sides. Homes in the border's path were evacuated without warning, their walls absorbed into the growing barrier. What began as barbed wire would soon transform into a fortress. 15-foot-tall concrete walls, electrified fences, and fortified towers stretching nearly 30 miles through Berlin. But on that first chaotic morning, there was still a fleeting chance for escape. The city erupted into chaos. Desperation ignited confrontations between Berliners and East German soldiers as panicked citizens made last-ditch efforts to reunite with loved ones or flee to freedom. Crowds surged against armed guards, pleading, shouting, and daring to defy the barricades. Desperate Berliners jumped from rooftops and windows, risking their lives to escape, while West German emergency responders scrambled to save as many as possible before the East German authorities sealed the borders completely. Even East German border guards joined the frenzy, leaving barbed wire to reach the west. One soldier, Konrad Schumann, took a leap across the barbed wire, defecting to West Germany before the iron walls closed behind him. Schumann remembers the moment vividly, quote, "My nerves were at breaking point. I was very afraid. I took off, jumped, and into the car. In 3-4 seconds, it was all over." Others took even bolder steps, with another soldier hijacking a tank to ram through the barrier in an attempt to flee from Soviet control. The Soviets struck back mercilessly, authorizing guards to fire upon anyone attempting to cross and installing harsh defensive measures along the wall. Over the years, more than 140 people would perish trying to escape. Images of the desperation in Berlin flooded the West, sparking outrage and condemnation. Yet the Soviet Union had carefully maneuvered within the bounds of international agreements, leaving the Western Allies powerless to intervene militarily. But in Washington, President John F. Kennedy saw beyond despair. He knew this moment was more than a humanitarian crisis. It was a critical test of Western resolve against the Soviets. The world was watching, and he had to act quickly. War looms closer. By late October, the situation in Berlin hit a critical breaking point. Soviet tanks rumbled into position on the eastern side of Checkpoint Charlie, their barrels aimed toward the west. In response, American tanks rolled forward, engines growling as they mirrored the Soviet maneuver. The two forces, separated by a mere 100 yards, stood locked in a stalemate, each side's soldiers gripping their weapons, awaiting orders. For a moment, it was as if history were circling back to the chaos of 1945, with the charred ruins of the Battle of Berlin threatening to come alive once more. Only this time, the destruction would expand further than the German capital. The Soviet Union had recently unveiled their intercontinental ballistic missile, rockets capable of carrying warheads thousands of miles away, reaching targets across continents and leaving no place on Earth safe from their wrath. War was about to explode in Berlin, but the bombs deployed by the Soviets could very well arrive at the White House's doorstep. In Washington, Kennedy discussed the best route for action with his advisors. General Thomas Power of the Strategic Air Command put it plainly: if war was inevitable, the U.S. should strike first. The alternative could have seemed extreme at one point, but by 1961, the president's men were already working on this aggressive approach. As Deputy National Security Advisor Carl Kaysen placed a highly classified document before Kennedy, the president began to visualize the destructive scale of an operation designed to cripple the Soviets before they even had a chance to respond. Through NATO's single integrated operational plan, America could go for a first-strike nuclear attack, synchronizing a massive launch of explosives targeting as many enemy assets as possible. With an arsenal of nuclear weapons, including hydrogen bombs, hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, the Pentagon believed a first strike against Soviet military targets could succeed if executed swiftly. However, Kennedy remained reluctant to authorize such an action. He recognized that while technically possible, a nuclear strike would not only lead to unimaginable casualties, but also plunge the world into an era of destruction unlike anything humanity had ever faced. As the world held its breath, tense negotiations continued behind closed doors. The UK and France, wary of escalating the conflict and hesitant to commit additional resources, relied heavily on America to shoulder the burden of Berlin's defense. Meanwhile, the US government, acutely aware of the immediate threat posed by Soviet military action, but reluctant to take the conflict to nuclear territory, opted to buy more time by sustaining the deployment of conventional troops and tanks to the region. Then, on October 30th, just 3 days after the opposing tanks were deployed to Checkpoint Charlie, Kennedy's fears about an impending nuclear war seemed to materialize. Soviet power unleashed. The whole world trembled as a Soviet Tu-95V bomber dropped a payload over the serene skies of Sukhoi Nos in the Arctic archipelago of Novaya Zemlya. Suspended by a parachute, the bomb, codenamed AN-602, but more widely known as the Tsar Bomba, began its slow descent. This unconventional measure wasn't to ensure the explosive worked properly, but rather to protect the crew on board the aircraft, who right after making the release hurried to flee from the area, knowing that upon detonation they would only have about a 50% chance of surviving. The bomb itself was a towering 26 feet long and weighed 60,000 pounds, yet this would be nothing compared to its destructive measures. The Tu-95V veered sharply, throttling its engines to their limit as the armored casing of the bomb approached touchdown. Then, the world became quiet for a second. As the Tsar Bomba detonated, it unleashed a fireball unlike the world had ever seen, spanning over 5 miles in diameter. The searing orb scorched the atmosphere, visible from more than 600 miles away, as if a second sun had risen in the Arctic. A giant mushroom cloud erupted, surging 42 miles into the sky, piercing the mesosphere higher than commercial aircraft dare to fly. The explosion's yield was calculated at 50 megatons, equivalent to 1,570 times the combined force of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a thermonuclear aerial bomb, the most destructive explosive in the history of mankind. The force of the blast was so colossal that in the remote village of Dixon Island, nearly 500 miles away, windows were shattered. Temporary radio communication blackouts stretched across vast distances, leaving the modern world momentarily voiceless in the shadow of the explosion. Even U.S. intelligence, monitoring the test from afar, felt the impact. Reports of the detonation reached Washington, leaving American policymakers and military leaders grappling with the intimidating realization of what they were up against. For the world's sake, the situation in Berlin had to be diffused. Fragile peace. Diplomats worked tirelessly, navigating a labyrinth of Cold War tensions to resolve the crisis. Direct communications between Moscow and Washington became the critical lifeline, preventing a public spiral into ultimatums and potential disaster. Despite deep mistrust, President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev walked a fine line, balancing displays of power with the looming specter of global destruction. Each leader remained keenly aware of the risks, unwilling to gamble on discovering how far the other would go to defend their claims. In the end, restraint prevailed. Both sides refrained from overt provocations, agreeing to incremental force withdrawals that diffused the immediate crisis. The outcome was an unspoken but clear compromise. The Soviet-constructed Berlin Wall would stand unchallenged. It would remain that way for the next 28 years. The Cold War had narrowly escaped one of its most explosive moments, but this uneasy peace would prove fleeting. Within a year, tensions would flare again, this time on the shores of Cuba. The missile crisis would catapult the world even closer to nuclear war, escalating the conflict that had simmered in Berlin to an entirely new level, and bringing the world just one step closer to the most destructive war it had ever encountered.